Have you ever picked up a novel by a really famous Pakistani author and had this feeling that something was off? Like the world inside its pages doesn't quite match the country you know? Well, today we're diving deep into a fascinating critique that asks a really provocative question. Are these celebrated books authentic, or are they a product carefully packaged for a very specific audience? And this, right here, is the central question of our entire explainer. Are these writers, the ones winning awards and topping bestseller lists in the West, truly the voice of the people? Or, as this analysis suggests, are they just a modern version of an old colonial elite, totally disconnected from the very people they're supposed to be writing about? Let's get into it. So, the analysis zeroes in on several key figures in what's called Anglophone literature. That means authors writing in English. We're talking about names you've almost certainly seen on bookshelves: Nadim Aslam, Kamila Shamsi, Hanif Qureshi, and others like them. And their deep connections to the West, whether through education or publishing, are absolutely central to this whole critique. This brings us to our first big idea, the whole question of representation itself. I mean, who gets to tell a story? And whose story is it really? The source makes a really bold claim right out of the gate. It argues that the version of Pakistan we see in these novels is, well, pretty much unrecognizable to the average Pakistani. The characters, how they think about faith, their day-to-day lives, the argument is that these things are just fundamentally out of touch with the reality on the ground. Now, to really understand this argument, you have to look back in time. The analysis frames this entire literary trend not as something new, but as a kind of echo from the colonial past. So here's the crucial point. These writers aren't seen as some new, groundbreaking voices. Instead, they're presented as the heirs to a very specific class, the English-speaking elite that once worked with colonial powers. According to this view, they're still disconnected from the general population. It's like the stage has changed from the colonial drawing room to the International Literary Festival, but the players are essentially the same. And this quote from Carlos Fuentes, which the source uses, just nails the historical argument. It suggests that the literature that came out of the colonial era was often written from a place of privilege. It wasn't the voice of the suffering masses, but of those who were kind of shielded from the worst of it. The analysis basically applies that same logic to these writers today. Okay, so if that's the history, what's the motivation now? This brings us to a huge part of the analysis, the powerful, and I mean powerful, influence of the literary marketplace. This is where the critique gets really sharp. It suggests that culture itself has been turned into a commodity. The global publishing world isn't just looking for good stories, it's looking for a very specific, a very marketable version of Muslim identity, a kind of prepackaged product that it already knows how to sell. So, what's inside this package for sale? Well, according to the source, these are the themes that are always in high demand. Narratives about oppression, suffering women, religious extremism, and characters who are always confused or hypocritical about their faith. The argument is that these themes sell because they fit into a narrative that the West is already familiar and comfortable with. This quote just reinforces that idea perfectly. The author is no longer just a storyteller. They become a cultural informant. They're marketed as someone giving you an authentic inside look, even if, as the critique suggests, the view they're selling isn't representative of, almost anyone. Okay, so that's the theory. It's a big one. But what's the proof? Let's turn to how the analysis actually digs into the novels themselves to back all this up. First up, we have Nadim Aslam, a hugely acclaimed author. The analysis takes a really close look at how his books portray religion and religious people. So in a novel like Maps for Lost Lovers, the source argues that religious characters are almost always shown as cruel, intolerant, and hypocritical. It points out that when scripture is quoted, it's not really to explore the depth of faith, but to show how fanatical or backward a character is, which, you have to admit, fits perfectly into that marketable package of extremism. Next, the analysis turns its attention to the celebrated author Kamila Shamsi and how her work deals with Muslim identity in our modern world. In a book like Home Fire, the critique is that Muslim identity is almost impossible to separate from the idea of terrorism and government suspicion. It fits so neatly into that marketable product we talked about, right? Where faith isn't a source of community or strength, but of conflict and danger. And finally, the analysis looks at the work of Hanif Qureshi, whose novels often explore the lives of South Asians living in Britain. The argument here is that Qureshi's Muslim characters often become symbols, fitting into these specific sellable tropes. They're either struggling with sexual repression or they're religious hypocrites. The analysis claims there's a real lack of characters who are just, balanced, thoughtful, and secure in their faith. And the suggestion is that maybe that kind of nuance just doesn't sell as well. Now, the source does draw a really interesting parallel here. It points out that using religious text to critique or subvert your own culture isn't unique. I mean, think about works like The Last Temptation of Christ or even Life of Brian with Christianity. But the key difference, it argues, is the context. It's one thing when a dominant culture critiques itself, but it's another thing entirely when a minority culture is being defined for an outside audience. So after laying out all of this evidence and all these arguments, what's the final verdict from this critical analysis? Are these writers representative or not? The analysis really boils its conclusion down to four main interconnected points. 1. These writers do not represent the average Pakistani Muslim. 2. They're basically a new version of the old colonial elite. 3. Their writing, because it focuses so heavily on these specific themes, ends up distorting the culture it's supposed to portray. And finally, number 4, this entire category of literature is a political product, made to order for the Western market. And what all that means at the end of the day is that the truth of daily life for millions of Pakistanis, their faith, their family, their resilience, is almost completely missing from the very books that are supposed to be their voice on the world stage. And that leads us to this final incredibly powerful thought, the difference between a story written about a people and a story written at them. It's a really provocative idea to end on, making you question who really controls the narrative and who that narrative is truly for. It definitely leaves you with a lot to think about.